Here in this application, we would provide a better user experience if we would immediately update this like status even before it has been processed in the database. And that's a concept or a pattern called optimistic updating, which in the end simply means that we're optimistic that our update will work, and therefore we want to show the new state immediately to the user and perform the update behind the scenes, and then only if that update would fail or something like this, we want to roll back the update. And React and Next.js make that simple and straightforward because React provides another built-in hook called useOptimistic, which you can use to perform such optimistic updates. And therefore, that's a hook we'll use now. For that, back in this posts.js file in the components folder, I want to update my posts here, which I'm outputting, optimistically whenever the data for one of those posts changed. Now, therefore, I'll start by calling useOptimistic from inside this posts component. And I'm actually doing this here in the posts component because it's actually the entire posts array that's being fetched from the database for this posts page. And it's that entire list of posts that in the end got updated, therefore. So here I'm calling useOptimistic, but in order to call it, we must import this hook from React. So here at the top of the file, you should import useOptimistic from React, like this. Now with that, we can call useOptimistic here in the posts component, and this hook now takes a couple of inputs and gives us a couple of outputs. The first input it takes is the data with which we want to start. So the data we fetched from the database, in this case, the posts array. That's the first argument you should pass to useOptimistic. The second argument is a function that will be called automatically by React in the end when you tell it to call it, and you'll see how that works in just a second, that will update this posts array optimistically. So this will be a function that changes this posts array on the client side until the change has been processed on the server side, so that we can change it immediately and then only sync it back with that server-side state once that server-side update has been performed. For that, this function should then take two arguments, where the first argument is the old posts state, so to say. So for example, the initial array of posts. And the second argument is some data that allows us to perform the update. And it will be up to us to define which kind of data we expect here. In my case here, I expect to get the updated post ID. So the ID of the post that should switch from liked to not liked or vice versa. And then we need to add our logic for manipulating the posts to this function body. Now, before we do that, let's talk about the things we get back from useOptimistic, because that will be two elements. It will be an array with two elements, to be precise. And the first element will be the updated posts array, the optimistically updated post array, and therefore I'll name it optimistic posts. The second argument will be a function which we can call to trigger that optimistic update. So to trigger this function, which we pass as a second argument to useOptimistic in the end. And I'll call this update optimistic posts. Obviously, these names are up to you. We can then use the optimistic posts instead of the posts from the database in all the places where we used posts. So for example, here in this if check, and also here for looping through them. And we'll soon call this function. For now, we will just assume that it is being called with the ID of the post for which the user changed the like status. And therefore now in this function body, we want to update this posts array accordingly. And I'll start by getting the index of the post that should be updated. So that should switch from liked to not liked or the other way around. And we can get that by taking a look at the previous posts, so the old posts array, and call the findIndex method, which is a default method built into JavaScript, which executes a function on every item in that array. And in that function, we should return true or false. And for that, I'll compare the ID of every post in that array to the updated post ID here. And if we got a match, it will give us the index of that post in the previous posts array. And that's then stored in this updated post index constant. Now, it is possible that we don't find such a post, and therefore I'll check if updated post index is equal to -1, which is a value findIndex will return if it did not find a post for that condition. And in that case, I just want to return the unchanged old posts. But if we make it past this if check, we did find a post that should be updated, and I want to update this in an immutable way now. So I'll create an updated post, which is a new object, into which I'll copy all the properties of the old post, which I'll get by accessing my previous posts for that updated post index. So that will give me access to one specific post, and I'll spread all the properties of that post into a new object. Then I'll change that updated post and set the likes property, which is the number of likes this post has, which I'm not using here, but which I still get from the database. I'll set that to the updated post likes we had. And then it depends on whether the post was liked before or not, because I either want to deduct a value or add a value. So I'll check if the updated post is liked, is true. And if that's the case, I want to deduct a value because it was liked and now it's not liked anymore. So I want to reduce the number of likes. Otherwise, I want to add a like. And more importantly for our application here, I of course also want to set the isLiked property for a given post to the opposite of what it was, with help of the exclamation mark operator. Like this. This will make sure that we switch it from liked to not liked or the other way around. And then I'll create a new posts array where I copy all my old posts, and I want to overwrite the post at this updated post index position with my updated post. That would be an immutable way of creating a new posts array with an updated post based on the old data. And then here in this function, which we passed to useOptimistic, we should return that updated posts array. And React will then make that updated array available through that optimistic posts element it returns in this array, which is returned by useOptimistic. So all we now have to do is make sure that we call update optimistic posts and that we pass the ID of the post that should be updated to this function in the end, so that it will be forwarded to this function. And we can do that by creating a new action here. And for that, I'll add an action function here, and I'll name it update post. And I expect to get the post ID as an argument here, just as we did in our server action function before. And in there, I'll call update optimistic posts and forward the post ID to this function. And that's now, of course, the function provided by that useOptimistic hook. And thereafter, I want to call my toggle post like status function and also pass the post ID to that. And in order to use await here, we should use async here. And by adding async here, we'll also be able to use this even though I did not add use server here. But NextJS does allow us to also set functions like this as client actions, therefore, if they have async in front of them. So now it's this update post function that should be passed to this post component. So there we, for example, should add an action prop though the name of this prop is up to you because it's your component. But you should pass update post as a value to that prop. And then in that component, we should accept that action prop, or whatever you named it, and use that as a value for this form action. And you still should bind the post ID because we still need that. But with that, we now again got an extra intermediate form action that will be executed first and that will trigger our optimistic update and also make sure that we trigger that server action behind the scenes. But thanks to this optimistic update, the UI should update immediately, and then the server action still does its thing, and React and Next.js will then sync everything thereafter once the server action is done. That's how you can think about that. So with that, if you save that all, you'll see we get an error that use optimistic only works in client components. Well, that's no problem. We can simply add use client at the top here because the only server action we're using in that file is defined in a separate file. So we can add use client without problems here at the top of this file that holds the post and posts components. And with that saved, we can reload again. We can see our posts. And now if I unlike that, for example, you see it's immediately unliked. If I like it, it's immediately liked here. And we don't have to wait for that server action to finish. And that's optimistic updating in action.